Welcome to our third Thursday. That's actually a week late. So this is the fourth Thursday, but I'm Carl Kim, the Executive Director of the National Disaster Preparedness Training Center. And we have our monthly third Thursdays as an opportunity to reconnect, to share news, and then usually we take on a topic, an important topic for discussion. And we have three really excellent presenters lined up for today. But before I introduce them, what I would like to say is that we've been very, very busy. This week, we were part of the Association of Pacific Rim Universities conference, which was on multi-hazards and disasters. And then prior to that, last week and the week before that, we've been very involved in supporting the search and rescue, the response efforts in Turkey as well too. I think at some future date, we will have a session about some of the lessons learned from that very large disaster in Turkey and Syria. Today's topic is something that's very important to us, and it's on social vulnerability indices. And we brought together three of our team members to talk about the work that they're doing. We're going to start with Lydia, who is our Associate Director for Development and Delivery. And in some ways, this is sort of beginning, at least for the center, with the end in sight. And part of what we're trying to do is to incorporate social vulnerability indices into the identification of training needs, and then the development of training courses that National Disaster Preparedness Training Center delivers throughout the country. So I'm going to ask Lydia to start off, and then following that, Associate Professor Suwan Shen will be talking about some of the work she's been doing. She's done a lot of work looking at different social vulnerability indices and then relating it to her current work in Hawaii and beyond. And then our final speaker is Lisa Webster, who is doing her MERP and capstone on social vulnerability indices. And so she will be presenting some of her research in progress. So with that, I think we have some good news. I was going to steal the thunder, but I'll let Lydia say that as well too. So Lydia.
Thanks, Carl. He stole my thunder yesterday, so I was teasing him that he has to leave it for me today. So Lydia Morikawa, Associate Director for Course Development and Delivery with National Disaster Preparedness Training Center. And we just wanted to lead off with a little bit of how today's session relates to NDPTC's training initiatives. And what we're looking at is basically training metrics that are tied to social vulnerability. What we have is this pretty map, and it shows the social vulnerability index mapped against where all of our participants come from. So as you can see, we have absolutely not hit every single vulnerable community, but we are definitely well on our way to doing so. A lot of what we look at is ensuring that our training is available to everyone, be that in course development, integrating different languages in the course development process, indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge. And of course, we are mandated by FEMA to make everything 508 compliant, so everything is accessible. In our delivery practices, we do very similar 508, 504 compliance, making sure everyone can access the venues and access the material. So that could be providing the material in accessible formats or alternative formats, and also delivering training in a way that we can reach the most people. So we do, I see many of you on that have already taken a lot of our classes and taken advantage of that. So we deliver training in both face-to-face modality as well as the virtual modality. What Carl was alluding to, and I'm trying to be very brief, sorry. What Carl is alluding to is that we've just pushed out our 2022 annual report, and we're very proud of that. If you would like to take a look at that, we'll be dropping that in the chat in a sec, if it's not already there. And in the report, we talk a lot about our climate initiatives and our initiatives related to social vulnerability and equity. We are looking very much at the training metrics tied to social vulnerability. And we always have an eye turned toward inclusivity. If there is something that we are not doing currently and you think would be a good idea, we always welcome your feedback. Please contact us and let us know what you think. We love to hear from all of our participants and potential participants. And I will toss back to Carl or straight to Suwan.
Yeah, thank you, Lydia, for reminding us of the important and unfinished work that we have to do in terms of better integrating social vulnerability indices into the course development and delivery. So our next speaker is Dr. Suwan Shen, who's an associate professor in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning. And she's going to talk about some of her research and work that she's been doing for many years, actually, on social vulnerability indices.
Thank you, Carl, for the introduction. And thank you for the opportunity here to share the work we have been working on. So I would say this is serving as a starting point of the work ahead for related to social vulnerability, but happy to share the work we already get started on this. So this is a collaborative research project we did over the past year with the ISR, the Institute for Sustainability and Resilience, Professor McKenna Kaufman, and also Narami and Anu Hito at the Hawaii Climate Commission. So we start this project with our objective and goals that trying to bridge the gaps between research and practice. So there's many in the academic literature, there are decades of literature related to how socially vulnerable, how the particular populations are vulnerable to hazards because of their social characteristics. And then there, in practice, there are many different versions of social vulnerability indexes being out there to support the practice decision makings. However, there's not really known about how the practitioners are really using it and what are their challenges or lessons we can learn from it. So that's the objective of this research, is that we try to support the State of Hawaii Climate Commission equity missions, and then try to identify how can we support the government entities here in Hawaii to use these social vulnerability theories and tools, and then try to address this inequitable distribution of benefits or burdens caused by climate change on the general public. So to do that, we start with I would say this is a starting point. We start with the landscape assessments of how social vulnerability data and information are being used in climate-related decision-making in Hawaii. And then we try to better understand what are the best practices in doing so, or moving forward, what are the gaps. So the things that we did for this project, we start with identifying social vulnerability indicators in the literature, and then we start reviewing the current practice, existing tools to identify social vulnerabilities across the nation and also at the local level for decision makings. And then we engage with the Hawaii State Climate Commission's WHOI members, stakeholders, relevant stakeholders to gather their feedback on how are they currently using these indexes or social vulnerability indicators here in Hawaii for practice in decision makings. We also reviewed the local plans and index for how do they use social vulnerability indicators for decision making. And then based on these reviews, we identified what are the gaps there. So in our final report, we created data availability tools, trying to combine the existing data sets related to social vulnerability, but then based on the gaps we identified through the research, and then created the Excel-based guide that bring together their exposures and social vulnerabilities here in Hawaii. But a lot of these data are available nationally. So there are many different social vulnerability literatures there, and then focusing on different vulnerable populations or in response to different type of hazards. So to start our work, we start with a review of wider social vulnerability tools and indicators for that are applicable here for Hawaii or just national-wise in general. So there's a report published online, and then you can take a look at this report we generated for more details. And also Lisa later will goes over some of the most popular used social vulnerability tools later in today's presentation. So some of the commonly used indicators, for example, based on starting with Susan Carter's hazards of place models, and then later on developed into the widely applicable CDC social vulnerability indicators and tools available across the nations, and also more recently trying to add in climate change as a component into that, like here locally in Hawaii. So we did a review of all these different tools that's available for practice and decision making in this report. But then what is more importantly is can we really use that? We reached out to over 50 highly relevant stakeholders that related to climate change decision makings, and they are concerned about social vulnerability. So we reach out to them and trying to have a basic idea, a baseline assessment of how these social vulnerability indicators and index are being used in practice. We ask them, have they used the index and how they use it? Do they have any lessons to share? If they don't use it, why they don't use it? And then we have a more in-depth discussion group meetings with these relevant WHOI members who have used this index or who haven't used but have some challenges and concerns to share with us. So we engaged 25 of them in more in-depth discussion meetings later. And then based on these in-depth discussions, we found that these social vulnerability indicators and index are very useful. But there's limitations to their usabilities in practice. So in general, the existing use is kind of limited to high level. A lot of agencies are trying to use it as a communication tools, and then or as a very good baseline assessment. However, in terms of very specific decision making, there are challenges for using them, embed them in decision-making practice. So we also are aware of that there are several departments here in Hawaii, like OHA and the Wahoo MPOs and also HDOT. They are currently undergoing their own efforts to develop their sector-related social vulnerability indicators and index to support decision makings. And we are following up with them on those as well. So in general, some of the feedback we hear from the WHOI members first, to our surprise, although there are many like exposure data already there, we do hear loud and echoed by several Hui members saying that more diverse, detailed, and up-to-date exposure data are much needed to support decision makings. And then especially these exposure data, because we keep adjusting the projections, we keep updating these based on the most recent sound scientific methodologies. There should be a mechanism to build this into the regular update and evaluating of the plans, of the implementations, evaluation process. So related to that is also about another key issues is that actually related to the geographical scale. So we hear people talking about in general, they need data at a finer spatial scale. So for example, the CDC's data, social vulnerability index, or a lot of other index are largely based on the US Census data, so that you don't have anything better than census block group or census tract. But that's not good enough for making decision makings. For example, when they go to implementations, when they try to approve, thinking about do we support the implementation of, let's say, building a seawall or not, they really need data at the parcel level or a community neighborhood level rather than at the larger scale. And then there's also very interesting findings is that there's many indexes out there, like social vulnerability index and then climate vulnerability index. But we hear from the relevant stakeholders in practice is that sometimes they feel, most of the time, they feel separate data and indicators are much more useful than composite index, especially when there's the index creation involves a lot of very complicated methodologies and hard to interpret these meanings intuitively. It's easier for them to try to cherry picking and then choose the relevant data that are relevant to their sectors. And then we hear that related to that is people are talking about there actually should be more focus, and which is a really research gap, is what is more important, not only about because the origination of the social vulnerability is from their trying to assess people's capacity to deal with disasters or hazards, and then what kind of demographic characteristics, socioeconomic characteristics makes them vulnerable. However, once we tease this out separately, we can't forget that the impact are so specific and detailed, and then we kind of missing the link about the interactions between the exposure and the vulnerabilities. So one example is, let's say, consider a person, elderly adults living in the coastal areas. So when we're talking about hurricanes, tsunamis, these elderly adults is very vulnerable to this because they might have limited mobilities. However, when we're talking about sea level rise, then it's probably related to their income levels, whether they have other available housing or not, what's their capacity to move in the long term. Then that's not relevant to their age, it's lesser or impacting factors. So all these will be depending on what kind of climate hazards we're talking about and the type of relevant or most relevant social vulnerable indicators should be chosen based on such interactions. But this is a missing link in the research and also in the practice. And this is a missing link that poses the challenges for practitioners to use it for decision makings. And the more research are needed in this area to support further understanding of the issues. And lastly, we do hear a lot of the department, they are in need of support of socially vulnerable geospatial data, but they don't have the capacity, they don't have the resources, the staff to process such data sets, especially some of the data sets, they are available in non-geospatial formats, let's say Excel tables or documents, then they will need help in terms of converting these to geospatial scales. So there's a desire to have a centralized state database and data processing capacities to assist them pick and choose the most relevant indicators related to their sectors from a centralized, for example, online portal to help them with that. So to address these needs and challenges identified, we developed a data availability tool based on Blakey's disaster pressure and release models. So we identify, based on that model, we identify the root causes of social vulnerability, and then we identify what are the potential unsafe conditions that related to these root causes, but then relevant to different type of shocks and stressors related to climate change. And we identify this for all the different type of climate shocks and stressors, and then for a variety of potential unsafe conditions. And using this as a guide, we created Excel-based tools that provides a guidance for people to choose the relevant climate change, social vulnerability indicators when we are talking about specific type of climate stressors and shocks. So this is one example related to what kind of climate exposure stressors when we're talking about sea level rise and chronic coastal erosions, what kind of unsafe conditions and data related to these unsafe conditions are available out there. And then we have it for all these different variety of shocks and stressors in the tools. The other thing we hear loud from the practitioners or WHOI members is about like the lack of resources and capacity to do things, right? So by communicating with the Climate Commission, we also recognize that currently the federal level, they have these justice body initiatives, which try to invest more of the federal fundings into disadvantaged communities for like infrastructure programs. And then for this, they currently have an interim guidelines identifying how do they define disadvantaged communities. And they have a climate economic justice screening tools available to support the decision at this level. However, it's very it's not customized to the local context, but this presents an opportunity to overlaying the works in social vulnerabilities, and then provides an opportunity for the relevant agencies maybe to obtain resources to pursue further in this area. So to help them with that, we also identified what kind of climate social vulnerable indicators and data are relevant to these climate justice body initiatives, and then what additional data these climate and economic justice screening tools provides in addition to the data source we identified there. So we provide this available, all these findings available on the Hawaii Climate Change Commission website. And lastly, for the tentative next step, based on what we learned through this project, we are currently working with the department to create a pilot study for how can we apply this, tailoring this more specifically to a particular sector and apply this within the sector. So currently we have another student working on her capstone, Kayla Palmer. On her capstone is identifying, interviewing the practitioners in the Department of Transportation and also in California, in New York, around the mainland, about what are the best practices transportation agencies can use these social vulnerability indicators, and what are the lessons learned that can be applied here in Hawaii. So another tentative future step is trying to develop a user-friendly database and data visualization portal that can support multiple agencies' individual efforts. So rather than developing another social vulnerability index visualization tools, so this will much more like a search engine or data portal search engine that help the relevant agencies, sectors choose the most relevant indicators related to specific type of hazards and specific type of stressors and shocks. We don't know when we can start working on this, but this is something that we think will be very helpful for the benefit of a variety of stakeholders. So that's all the findings we have in this project. I would say this will serve as a starting point of more important works related to social vulnerability applications in practice, and we hope we can carry forward this in the upcoming years.
Thank you very much, Suwan. Yeah, I hope we'll have some more time for questions and some discussion. But I wanted to move to our third presenter, Lisa Webster, who's finishing her capstone, her MERT capstone, shortly on this topic. And so, Lisa, are you ready to go?
Yes. Hi, Carl. Thanks. Okay, let me get back to sharing. Okay, can everybody see that?
Yes, it looks great.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about 3 social vulnerability indexes, or SVI frameworks, and look at themes and variables of each, and then look at some tools that incorporate social vulnerability data. And here's an overview of what I will cover today. So let's start by looking at some definitions of vulnerability. Vulnerability is a key factor in disaster risk, but it can be measured in a lot of ways. Flanagan defines social vulnerability as the socioeconomic and demographic factors that affect the resilience of communities. Cutter notes that it's partially the product of social inequalities, and FEMA defines it as susceptibility of social groups to the adverse impacts of natural hazards. And this includes disproportionate death, injury, loss, or disruption of livelihood. So who is vulnerable? A review of social vulnerability research indicates that vulnerable populations include low income, less educated, and minority communities, as well as the very young, the elderly, and those with disabilities. It's important to be able to identify vulnerable communities when planning for pre-disaster mitigation and post-disaster response. Once vulnerable communities are accurately identified, and this may vary from one type of disaster to another, pre-disaster activities could increase resilience through outreach and education. And post-disaster, it's critical to know which are the most vulnerable communities, because they will likely need the most support. So now we'll look at a few very highly used frameworks of social vulnerability. The 3 that we're going to look at are the CDC SVI, the USC SOVI, and the DOT RAISE tool. So we'll start with the CDC SVI. So the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registries Social Vulnerability Index, also known as the CDC SVI, is the one I'm most familiar with, and it recently had was updated with 2020 census data. So it's I feel like it's really relevant right now. So according to the CDC, this index helps local officials identify communities that might need support before, during, or after disasters. And the map shows overall social vulnerability, and the darker orange indicates more vulnerable areas. It's available at both county and census tract levels. It has 16 variables grouped into 4 themes. It can be disaggregated to view individual variables, and it is available in geospatial data formats. And as a side note, federal agencies are increasingly requiring incorporation of social vulnerability data into disaster management in order to qualify for funding. So there is a lot of interest right now in understanding it and using it. So this is the next framework that is very frequently referenced. This is the University of South Carolina's Social Vulnerability Index, also known as the SOVI, and it uses 2010 to 2014 census data. And according to the website for the SOVI, this data represents those social, economic, demographic, and housing characteristics that influence a community's ability to prepare for, respond to, cope with, recover from, and adapt to environmental hazards. So on this map, the red areas are more vulnerable, the blue areas are less vulnerable, and the white areas are somewhere in the middle. And the SOVI index is available at county and census tract levels and includes 29 variables grouped into 8 themes. So far, I am not able to find a way to disaggregate the data into themes or individual variables. And it is a little bit harder to access the geospatial data for this framework. And the third framework we're going to talk about is the DOT RAISE tool. So the U.S. Department of Transportation's Rebuilding American Infrastructure with Sustainability and Equity tool identifies persistent poverty, historically disadvantaged communities, urban areas, and tribal areas to help identify priority funding areas for critical transportation infrastructure projects. And if you line them up side by side and take a look, you can see there's areas of alignment between the 3 frameworks, which is indicated by the green circles, and areas that are inconsistently identified as vulnerable, indicated by the red circles. So what are some of the themes and variables included in each framework? So as I already mentioned, the CDC SBI has 16 variables grouped into 4 themes, and these are socioeconomic status, household characteristics, racial and ethnic minority status, and housing type and transportation. So darker areas are more vulnerable in each map. And by looking at the maps, you can see that not all census tracts are equally vulnerable to each of the different themes. So disaggregation of data helps identify focused areas of vulnerability. And for the USD SOVI, there are 29 variables grouped into 8 themes. And when we compare the two, on the left is the CDC SBI themes and variables. Themes are in black boxes and variables are the same color as the theme. And on the right is are the SOVI themes and variables. And in the middle are the variables that are shared between the 2 indices. And any highlighted variables are related but not identical between the 2 frameworks. So there is definitely some overlap. And in contrast, the DOT RAISE tool looks at only 4 variables: persistent poverty, historically disadvantaged communities, urban areas, and tribal lands. So considerations of granularity are also important, as Suwan mentioned. Data is often provided at the county or census tract levels, but might be more useful at the block group level. And for example, Hawaii only has 4 counties, where the average number of counties in the US is 62. So for us, county level data isn't all that helpful in general. This map depicts the overall social vulnerability of each county according to the USC SOVI. And this map shows the CDC SBI census tract level overall social vulnerability data. So because there was a lack of granularity of existing data, Carl asked me to build a custom SDI for Hawaii at the block group level back in 2020 to identify vulnerabilities to COVID-19. And these are some of the variables I included in it. And there's a story map out there that you can look at if you're interested. And here's a comparison of Kauai CDC SBI on the left and the custom SBI for Hawaii at the block group level on the right. And you can see that there is increased detail at the block group level, especially for lower population places like Kauai. And this can make it easier to figure out where exactly to focus efforts before and after disaster. And additional vulnerability considerations, FEMA's community lifelines are defined as the most fundamental services in the community that, when stabilized, enable all other aspects of society to function. So access to and continuation of these services is critical, and loss of these lifelines leads to sharp increases in community vulnerabilities. For example, when a community's road falls into the ocean and they're cut off because that's their only way in and out. So now let's look at some existing tools that use SBI. Two tools that incorporate SBI frameworks are the FEMA National Risk Index and the Resilience Analysis and Planning Tool, or RAPT tool. Both are FEMA tools. The National Risk Index is a new online mapping application from FEMA, and it identifies communities most at risk to 18 natural hazards. It visualizes natural hazard risk metrics, and it includes data about expected annual losses, social vulnerability, and community resilience. And they have data at both the county and census tract level. And they do provide geospatial data for your own analysis. The way that the National Risk Index calculates risk is expected annual loss times social vulnerability divided by community resilience. And the social vulnerability is calculated using the USC SOVI data. And this is so at the top of the web app for the National Risk Index, there are different tabs. So if you want, you can look at overall risk, or you can look at expected annual loss, social vulnerability, or community resilience, as each has its own map. So this is the expected annual loss map for Hawaii. And it's calculated for each hazard type, quantifies loss for buildings, population, agriculture, and population loss is monetized. Following hazards are considered. There's a list at the bottom. So it's very detailed, and you can look at data from each individual hazard. So it's a very helpful tool. And as I mentioned, there's also a community resilience part of the equation, and the way that it is calculated is based on these 49 indicators grouped into 6 themes. So I'm not going to go into any more detail than that about all of these themes and variables, but that is the National Risk Index tool. The next tool we're going to look at is the FEMA Resilience Analysis and Planning tool, the RAP tool. It basically gives everyone access to powerful data and GIS mapping to help better understand their community. And it includes 100 preloaded layers with community resilience indicators, current census demographic data, infrastructure data, data on weather, hazards, risk, and it has some analysis tools and ability to print. And you can also add data from other sources. So there are tabs that you can select different variables from in the RAP tool, and these include an infrastructure tab, hazards, county indicators, census indicators, and tribal indicators. Oh, and going back to this map, this is I selected like percent of people living in mobile homes. And then I overlaid that with tribal boundaries. And I thought that might be a good way to identify some areas that could use additional resources. So for this FEMA RAP tool, the Community Resilience Index includes these goals. And a couple of them stood out to me as I hadn't seen them in the other frameworks: households without a smartphone and Medicare recipients with power dependent devices. I thought those were interesting variables to consider. And then real quick, I'll go over my capstone research. So I'm basically in the process of identifying similarities and differences between existing social vulnerability indices. And next, I'm plan to look at which index or subset of an index would be most accurate in identifying vulnerable populations impacted by various local disasters in Hawaii. So for each of the following case studies, I want to ask the following questions. Do different social vulnerability frameworks identify the same populations as vulnerable? What areas are most impacted by these disasters? To what extent do these disasters affect socially vulnerable populations? And what should be the priority areas for recovery planning for Red Hill? And that's all I've got. Any questions?
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. That was really great. And if you look in the chat, we have lots of very interesting comments and people from all over the country that I think joined to because of the topic is so interesting and important and challenging. And I hope this is really valuable for you all to understand the different frameworks and approaches and the types of data that go into this, when we think about it, it's data to information to knowledge or actionable knowledge. And so I want to ask Suwan, Professor Shen, if she has any comments or reactions to Lisa's work, because I want to get some feedback on the direction she's going with that. And so Suwan, any thoughts or reactions to Lisa's work?
I think Lisa did an excellent job, like her presenting all these different commonly used vulnerability and resilience tools, which is very helpful. And and as I presented already, like one of the findings here is how does these socially vulnerable indicators and indexes really interact with specific type of stressors, shocks, and disasters, right? So when we're talking about, we need to contextualize these type of social vulnerabilities within what type of impacts we're talking about and the potential adaptations. So that's the suggestion I have for her capstone, like to dig into more local context of that and what kind of adaptation options they can have with that, and then relate to social vulnerability to the potential adaptation options and alternatives for that. But other than that, I think Lisa's presentation is excellent. I really enjoy the presentation. Great work.
Yeah, there's so much going on here. I mean, if you think about all the different types of data, all the different types of hazards and threats, and all the ways that you can sort of put these together and prioritize them and weight them. And there actually has not been enough sort of testing of this. And that's why I think it's really good to look at these, different types of hazards and threats, but place it within the context of, communities that we're familiar with. And then to really see how does this really add up in terms of the identification of vulnerabilities and so forth. So any other comments or suggestions from those who are joining in? Maybe if we switch to like, what do you call that? gallery mode. You can see. Are there any questions or comments? I can't really see any if there are any thoughts or reactions. I know many of you have been working on these issues or related issues, and so it's great to see so many of you joining from around the planet right now. And so I don't know if there are any comments or thoughts or suggestions to add before I start calling on people. I want to ask Eric Yamashita, are you on?
Yes.
Yeah. Can you give some of your reactions and take on
Yeah.
this?
I mean, I've been in touch with Lisa pretty much since she started discussing all this stuff, and yeah, we were talking about how all these different variables that go into it, and we're not quite sure, like you said, the how to test this, right? Because there's so many different, some of the SOVI has so many different variables that go into it, and how is it compared to SVI versus the other tools. So she and I have been kind of going back and forth about this, and she's focused on 3 different areas for her capstone. It's kind of I think there'll be, if she just focuses on SVI, then there'll be one result, and probably if she brings in SOVI, there'll be other results that may impact her findings. But I think this is a pretty interesting topic, and there's probably better ways to test statistically which variables are the best indicators of vulnerability here.
Yeah, and so much of this, I think, is it's related to the question that Jeff Rubin has posted in the chat section about really what is the unit of analysis. What happens when we try to go below the census tract or block groups or TAZs or other spatial units, and so that's one of the, I think, challenges that exists. I mean, the other, of course, obviously, is the difference between a nationwide perspective, which we have to have as a national center, versus a more community-based approach. So I don't know, Jeff, if you wanted to add more to your comment, which I was reading in the chat section. Yeah, Jeff?
It's an ongoing challenge, especially with the programs being pushed at by federal agencies. Here, use this, which is one step away from we're going to require you use this for various plans or grants. For me, it requires going into areas like deed registries or working with local public health and social service agencies. Public health has access to more of the HHS Empower data than emergency management does. But still, that's a pretty limited subset, and the hardest part is getting past. It's kind of the equivalent of the last mile, getting past what you can get from the large data sets and really tailoring it for rural areas or sparsely populated areas. Maybe not so much because there's less homogenization, but for the densely populated areas, you're homogenizing over so many people. It's such a challenge to draw meaningful conclusions, especially when everything is based on indicators.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think there's also a difference between kind of a researcher perspective, where we're really into the data and trying to, test the accuracy, the validity of the data, versus using this tool and assuming that the data is accurate, reliable, current, and so forth. So these are things that we are continuing to grapple with. NDPTC will be hosting the National Domestic Preparedness Consortium meetings the week of March 21st through the 23rd in Honolulu. And I believe that we will be bringing together many of the other consortium members who are also grappling with these issues. I hope that Lisa and Suwan will present both at those sessions, especially in the committees that are working on this. as well as in the upcoming Primo meetings, which are going to be the Pacific Risk Management Ohana meetings. They're going to be happening April 3rd through 6th in Honolulu in the convention center. And so if maybe Lydia or someone can post the information for both Primo and the consortium meetings as well too. We look forward to seeing you at those events as well too. I have to confess that this is a kind of a large work in progress. I mean, if you delve really deeply into some of these tools, they're not fully populated, and we need to use this data and then really figure out, as Lisa and Suwan have pointed out, what is the effect of the different choices that we're making in terms of the data and how we're using it for analysis. Are there other questions or comments that others have? Any other data people? I see so many of our former students and people that have, are subject matter experts and others who work on this. Any other comments or examples of where these issues have been addressed, fixed, or works in progress?
Hey, this is Don.
Yes,
Yeah.
Don. Yeah. Great.
Yeah, it's been a while. I've been out in the field with a lot of deployments for the disasters.
Yes.
I think I work with a bunch of people here too, including Mike Kern and so forth. Yeah, I mean, we were trying to incorporate a lot of this, the data metrics for a lot of how we implement some of our community planning and capacity building for our interagency recovery coordination efforts. So it was interesting on Lisa's side. Yeah, I mean, I never looked at all the other types of data that's available. And, for us to intertwine and for her to put that Venn diagram, it kind of showed some of the disparity that we have for some of the gaps that, we don't really address. And a lot of this equity and inclusion of our new initiative for in our strategic plan for FEMA incorporates a lot of that equity and diversity to be addressed, because in the past and for several decades we haven't addressed that. And in order for us to be inclusive with everyone, it's been important to have these data metrics, but it's not all encompassing, and a lot of it doesn't address some of our capacity building, because it's kind of skewed, especially when the like you said, the data source isn't up to date, or a lot of it is based on census data that might not necessarily have all the information. But like the gentleman said previously, the Health and Social Services, they have a better grasp of it. They do a lot of the recovery needs assessments on our part and what we work with. So that really helps us a lot, but to get the more up-to-date information, because a lot of times we do deal with the counties and the state that don't necessarily give us all that information, down at the basic level. So this is a little bit more of a data that we can get, and this information really helps me in understanding my current situation, where we're doing the California wildfires recovery, and then I guess we're switching over to the severe storms that happened in January. So in the past, it hasn't addressed a lot of these. We use our CCA, which you folks know, the community conditions assessment, and the SBI is part of that. And it also shows us a glimpse of what the communities, some of the community profiles, and what we can help to, in the most vulnerable parts of their municipalities in order to address their capacity. So, yeah. Thank you for all the information too. And I'm hoping that, I guess if I can contact Lisa later in some capacity as we move forward in some of our more future disasters and the current ones that we have right now. Thanks, Carl.
Yes, well, yeah, thank you for your comments and thank you all for the important good work that you are all engaged in. And I know that this is a really important, challenging topic. And we will continue to work and share information. And with that, any closing thoughts? Let's turn to Lisa. Hearing or seeing the comments, Lisa, any closing thoughts that you have before we bring today's session to a close?
There is a question about whether the slides can be shared, so I'm fine with that if you're okay with it, but it's
Yeah,
up to-
yeah, we can share the slides.
yeah,
Yeah.
just send me an email.
Yes.
And closing thoughts, I feel like I want to build a custom SVI based on SOVI so that I can disaggregate it and use those. But I really also generally feel like I've read some of the research saying that maybe poverty is as good an indicator as all of these other things in terms of. So I'd really like to explore that more and see if that ends up being really all you need to look at, or if there's really a lot more to it. So I'm just
Yeah,
food
that's
for thought.
really an interesting way of approaching it and thinking about not just poverty, but income or wealth or social welfare, I think is another way of sort of thinking about these things that we can measure. And so, so again, great work, Lisa. I'm really looking forward to you finishing your capstone as well too. And then also continue to engage with so many others who are on this call. So reach out to us if there are ideas that you have about what we can do to work more closely together, because these are tough and important challenges. So with that, what I'd like to do is to bring this month's third Thursday to a close. And so thank you all very much for joining us.